Okay, so let's get started. Danielle will come.
And I wanted to just let you know real quick. So we did get your assignment stuff, and I just got delayed. I'll get you comments by. I'm going to do the comments, and then I'm going to send them on to Sharon. So
that's why I didn't send any
you're
final.
good.
That's fine.
You're good. You're good. You're good.
You're good.
I want
No, you're good.
But then I came back on something.
We're all no.
Okay,
we got.
So
I got off track. So yes,
we want it to be iterative. Okay. It's helpful when we give back the comments and then you work on that draft and then
Yes,
so
because I didn't submit that yet.
You did the right thing.
That would be good too.
Yeah. So we are going to choose out because you have a lot of the project written up.
Mm-hmm.
But what we're going to do for the first part is just focus on the sections that we asked for in terms of our comments, right? And then
So we'll say we're commenting on this portion, and the other stuff is kind of extraneous, but we'll comment on this portion.
Okay.
And the final draft will comment on everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Great. So today we're going to talk about, as really our final lecture on data analysis, we're going to talk about data interpretation. And so some of this some of these topics we have touched upon because at various stages in the project, you do kind of, you're thoughtful at various stages and you implement these sort of thought processes, okay, including thinking about bias and confounding and all that we're going to revisit. But we're at the stage now where we have collected our data, cleaned our data, manipulated our data, let's say done the analysis, started writing it up, but we're looking at our results and we're trying to interpret our takeaway message, right, our associations. What are we finding? And when we do this, there are some obstacles that we face. So these are the topics we're going to talk about today. What is a spurious or let's say false or statistically false versus a real association, right? I put those in quotes, air quotes. Bias, we'll touch upon bias again. Causality, when do we say something's causal? When is it not causal? Residual confounding, what about confounding but leftover confounding? Hi, how are you? Welcome. And then what about our unexpected or non-statistically significant results? Okay, so we're going to touch upon all these topics today. So in order to talk about this, there are different ways to go about it. I'm going to use this kind of outline as our framework, this sort of thought flow chart. The first question to approach this data inference is this a real association that I found? And we'll talk about what real means. So is there really this association between my predictor, my risk factor X, and my outcome, okay? And if this is a real association, if I'm determining that it's real, meaning that I've minimized bias to the extent that I can, that I find statistical significance in a thoughtful, reasonable way, is this association due to confounding? Is it due to some alternative explanation? And then finally, is the association similar in the subgroups, right, according to another variable, i.e. interaction? Is there some kind of potential interaction I can explore? So that's kind of the basic outline of how we're going to flow through it. But let's start with, is this a real association? So here we have the correlation between the number of people who drowned by falling into a swimming pool and the number of films that Nicolas Cage appeared in, okay? This is a real correlation, and it's 0.67, which is fairly high. And by the way, I don't know if you guys know who Nicolas Cage is. I showed this to undergraduates.
So badly recently that maybe there is a correlation.
I have to find a new. No, I showed this to undergraduates who, for sure, they're like, "Who's he?"
Oh.
I got to update my slides, but anyway. So this is to say that you can find correlations in the world, right? So this is 0.67. How about this one? Per capita consumption of mozzarella cheese and the civil engineering doctorates awarded in the U.S. 0.96. You can find fairly high correlations into different measures in the world. What is the problem with this? Or is there a problem? Is there a problem?
But then don't have any actual correlation.
There is a correlation, but it's
not causal.
Well, it's not that it's not causal necessarily, but it's, right, we have no explanation for it, right? So before you even get to causal, which we'll see requires a lot of criteria to go through, we're looking for associations need to have some sort of biologic plausibility or some sort of plausibility. That is the first step in the scientific method. We don't just take associations and find, we are in this big universe. You will find correlations between a lot of things. In fact, I don't know, the British Medical Journal has a Christmas edition every year. Have you guys ever seen that? It's a very funny, satirical research article that they come out with every year. And they do things like, they had the number of births and the number of storks in a particular neighborhood. And they'll do a whole study. And so, right, and you'll find associations between things, but the first step, that's why the first step in the scientific method is what is your hypothesis? And that's how we function, right? We go by hypothesis. Some of real life examples of, and this may be more biologically plausible, but the whole movement to find an association between autism and, the MMR vaccine was based on a correlation, a supposed correlation. That correlation wasn't even strong enough. Now, what is the biologic plausibility? Look, sometimes we don't really have strong biologic plausibility. When John Snow and the cholera epidemic of 1850s associated the cholera epidemic with water, there was no germ theory yet. So we don't want to impose a very strict criteria for this, because there are times we're going to have new diseases and new conditions that we don't have all the answers in terms of biologic plausibility, but there needs to be some reasonable plausibility to engage in a scientific hypothesis and study. Okay? So if you could figure out the cheese and the civil engineering doctorate awarded, I'd probably think of something. But. Okay, so take a second to read this cartoon because it's funny, but same kind of issue. Correlation versus causation. So we hear that all the time. So aside from the fact that a scientific study needs to have that first step, that first hypothesis with some kind of biologic study, even when you then find correlation, that doesn't necessarily mean causation. So we're going to talk about how do you determine causation? What are the criteria used for that? As an epidemiologist, you almost never want to even say or breathe the word causation. The criteria are very high to determine causality. Okay, so let's go back to that first step in this data inference set of questions. My chair keeps going down. And that is your association spurious? Is it somehow false due to chance, or is it real? So what are some of the things that we take into account when we think about this question? So there are two main things. The first question is this due to chance? Okay, now how do we determine if something's due to chance? What's the testing method we use for that? What's the barometer we always say? P-values, right? P-values are actually our method to determine, is this likely to be a true association that I'm seeing, or could it be due to chance? That's all we're saying when we talk about a p-value. Okay, and we're going to review very briefly what a p-value is. So when thinking of something's due to chance, we have a few things that we want to think about aside from testing associations. Biologic plausibility that we talked about, right? So we need some kind of clear, again, there might be new diseases out there, new associations. You may not have the pure physiological mechanism, outlined because we don't know everything, but you do want some suggested biologic plausibility. We want to test these associations statistically. And I'm going to try another chair. And then we have the issue of multiple testing, which we talked about. So multiple testing is if we do enough tests, right, we are going to find associations with some things due to the fact that, as I just mentioned, observing in life, you will find correlations between things, between measures, especially with high sample sizes. You will just find correlations, statistical correlations. So you need to balance your statistical testing with your a priori hypotheses, okay? And that's why we don't go fishing, right, when we're doing analyses, when we're doing research, because If we go fishing, we will find correlations, and then that's bad science, right? Because we haven't thought about it beforehand. A second thing to consider in this kind of part of your data inference is, has there been any serious bias or possibility of bias? Now, we talked about bias when we design a study, but this is always something to revisit during the course of a study. Is it possible, and especially at your data inference stage, as you work through everything, as you look through the included versus excluded group, as you're actually reviewing all your results, is it possible that there was some additional bias that you hadn't considered before? So it's always important to kind of go through those, that thought process. And as you're writing the discussion section and you get to limitations, that's where you're really thinking that through. So when you think about bias, we can think about the that case control study with the coffee drinking and pancreas cancer, right? And the bias of choosing controls from a specific population led to misleading results, right? So usually it's not that egregious, but it could be, and we have to revisit that when we infer the takeaway messages of our associations that we found. So I know you guys have all looked at p-value, but let's just review quickly what we're really talking about when we're talking about p-value. Okay, so think of this of a 2x2 table, right? So this typical epidemiologic 2x2 table. Here we have our test conclusions, and here we have real life. Okay, so we have 4 possibilities in this kind of more binary example. So either the treatments are not different from each other, or they are different, okay, meaning our new treatment work that we're testing. And in real life, they're not different from each other, and they are different, okay? So our 2 correct possibilities is either we found the treatments are not different from each other. That could be correct. We found the treatments are different from each other. That's also correct, all right? Those are our 2 correct possibilities. Now, this is power. Do we have enough power to find differences that are correct between the treatments, okay? In terms of our p-value, which the possible errors, we have a type 1 error where we say they're different when they're not. We have a type 2 error when we say they're not different and they really are, okay? And everything about what we do is balancing these errors, because if you're going to, have a very, very sensitive test, bless you, you are going to give up a little bit of specificity, right? And if you have a very specific test, you're going to give up a little sensitivity. When you minimize one error, you're going to give yourself a little bit more wiggle room for the other error, right? So it's all a balance. Which of these errors are we referring to? And it's on the slide if you really want to look through it. When we talk about p-values, which of these errors, type 1 or type 2? 1, right. So when we are talking and reporting about p-values, we are talking about our hypothesis with regard to the null hypothesis. Null hypothesis means no difference, okay? If we are asserting, we are saying, we have found a difference, we need to report how much type 1 error we have. We are asserting that there's a difference between our 2 treatments or associations. And we want to let everyone know that the probability that this is due to chance is really small. R small is usually less than 0.05, okay? That's all the p-value is. Now I'm saying that's all it is because it's arbitrary. Why do we say less than 0.05, right? It could have been less than 0.01. That's a standard that we have set in the research world, but it's not we have to remember that that's somewhat arbitrary. So if we find a p-value of 0.055, that doesn't magically mean that there's suddenly no association, and a second ago, 0.005 will make this big difference between utilizing a treatment and not utilizing a treatment. All cutoffs and cut points we make in the clinical world too are somewhat arbitrary, but we have to make them based on the best evidence that we have, right? But we do have to keep that in mind, that this is just a measure of how much is this relationship due to chance or not, Okay, we have to keep that in mind when we make inferences about what our data is showing us. So common mistakes related to the inference that are based on like statistical significance and point estimates tend to be these three. So the first is, we'll talk about this a little further, so I'm just going to mention it now, that the presence of an association, I found some sort of relative risk or odds ratio or hazard ratio, that it reflects some sort of causality, okay? That is not the case. Now, the way we determine causality, we have a lot of other criteria. One of them, what would be one way that some kind of evidence that you would need for causality that you could just think of off the top of your head?
Like one comes before the other.
Right, so a temporal relationship, right? So longitudinal studies help us determine that. If you do not have some kind of temporal relationship where you set up your risk factor and then the disease follows that risk factor, until you have that, there's no way to determine causality. Now, you could say there's evidence that suggests, we'll talk about wording, right? You cannot say it causes the other, right? It's just not, it's not correct to say. So a highly statistically significant association or a very large, nice odds ratio does not mean that there's a causal relationship between the predictor and the outcome. That's a common mistake. The second one is that statistical significance measures the strength of an association. That is not the case, okay? It measures the probability that this association is due to chance. It doesn't measure the magnitude of the association. Those are two different things. And then the third common mistake is that the magnitude of the estimate is comparable across the variables. So that think of a point estimate, think of the actual relative risk or odds ratio, that you can just compare the odds ratio of apples to the odds ratios of oranges, right? Those numbers refer to units of that particular measurement. So whereas if we are going to compare systolic blood pressure and the odds ratio for age, for systolic blood pressure, we're talking about 1 unit of blood pressure versus 1 year. Those are two totally different measurements, right? We can't just compare odds ratios when they're different measures. Okay, so we'll talk about what we do to do that. So let's look at an example. These are mortality rate ratios. You could just think of them as relative risk. And we're looking at current, former, and non-smokers. Non-smokers here is the reference. Okay, so we're talking about current smokers versus non-smokers, former smokers versus non-smokers. Okay, and then the different causes of death: lung cancer, coronary heart disease, and stroke. Take a quick, brief look at these point estimates, these mortality rate ratios, and tell me some of the conclusions that you would come to. Just in broad strokes.
Higher in smokers.
Okay, so what is?
Smoker have high risk for
Mortality
cancer,
rate is
coronary
higher.
heart disease, and stroke.
Okay, so wait, so lung cancer, so we see lung cancer, and what else did you say? Coronary heart disease and stroke, but are you looking at those are confidence intervals. What are you taking away from the confidence intervals?
I mean, there's a high range.
Right, but they cross
They
over.
overlap each other.
They overlap each other, but they overlap
one.
one, right? Which means you wouldn't call it statistically significant, right? But so which ones? So it looks like, for example, the former smokers, the lung cancer former smokers, that point estimate is not statistically significant or borderline marginal. For stroke current smokers, it's not. For the stroke former smokers, it's not either. Now, would it be correct to say there is no association between stroke and smoking? stroke deaths and smoking. Would that be correct to say? Why not? It's not statistically significant. Now, I'm not saying what you know in the world.
Yeah.
But you would question this because you know it, right? Yes.
Is this? I feel like this is sort of evolving a bit, like
In what?
recently in particular, from what I've seen. Like I feel like there's been sort of a hard and fast line that statistically significant, black and white, and the stroke values are on the not significant side of that because they cross one. And I was going to ask, and I hope it's not too much of a tangent, but I feel like there's been sort of a cultural shift towards these numbers are darn near significant, right? And to understand the grayness of that,
Right.
and maybe that has to do with how we actually word it, because strict statistical significance, neither one of those values passes that bar, but
Right. So
it's
what
awfully
I'm trying
close.
to get at is, so what do we take away from
That
that?
it might not have been powered to detect the difference.
Right. So what's my clue? Why would I never use language? And I think that you're right that there's more awareness of this, but it hasn't shifted in terms of what's always been correct. It's just that I think with the training and statistics for non-statisticians, I think that, and I include myself as a non-statistician, right? I wasn't trained as a statistician, I was trained as an epidemiologist, and it's a little bit different because you utilize this tool, it's really a tool to help you establish, evidence, but it's being utilized not in the correct way. So here, as Danielle mentioned, what are we looking at? So when we look at just pure statistical significance, yes, we are looking at the confidence interval. But in words, what does a confidence interval mean? What does confidence interval mean? It means that there's a range within which the true answer is in this range, okay? And the true answer is likely centered around the point estimate. Less likely to be around this range, and I'm going to show you a pictorial graph of this, okay? Less likely to be at 0.9, less likely to be at 4.9, somewhere in the middle, and somewhere probably closer to this point estimate. That's around what we should be thinking of. Now, this point estimate is 2.1. That's way above 1. That's double the risk of a non-smoker. That means there's a risk of death associated with smoking, with risk of stroke death associated with smoking. That is a fair thing to say. Then you add the words, and it happens to be not statistically significant. But the risk I get from the point estimate, okay? That's what I'm getting from the point estimate. So by saying something is not statistically significant, that is correct. By saying there is no risk, that would be incorrect. Because my point estimate is showing me risk. It's just not statistically significant. If I had an enormous confidence interval, it would be a little of a I'd have to make that more of that. If I have a more narrow confidence interval and it's just marginal, I can use the words marginal. A lot of it is wordsmithing, but behind the wordsmithing is the accuracy of the level of accuracy of what you're saying, right? So let's look at a pictorial graph of this. So this is in Javier Nieto was my epidemiology teacher, and he always taught me this. He always taught this. This was like a big pet peeve of his. The confidence interval is saying that with 95% certainty, the real answer is somewhere in the middle. But as I said, the real answer is likely to be, the likelihood is higher around my point estimate. The likelihood falls as I get to the edges of the 95% confidence interval, okay? This little area here and here is the less than 0.05 part. That's part not in my confidence interval, okay? I'm less confident that the truth is there. This is the way some people think about it, and this is incorrect. What this is saying is there's just as much likelihood that the true answer falls anywhere in that confidence interval, and that's not true statistically. Okay, so we have to think about it more in the B graph when you're inferring the results. Okay, a word about comparing the point estimates across the variables, just to get a sense of what I was talking about. So this is something that we did before. You don't have to look at every line, just look at the top line for each variable. So these are 3 measures of social engagement. And the outcome here is cognitive function. Okay, so let's just look at executive function. We have a measure of contacts, social contacts, a measure of social support, and the measure of social strength. And then we have these point estimates, okay, which are regression coefficients. It's a linear model. So we have 1.58, 1.69, 1.7, and negative 2.6. Now they're the directions we expect, because we expect higher executive function with higher contacts, higher executive function with higher support, and then higher executive function with lower social strain. Okay, so this made sense in terms of our expectations. The asterisk shows statistical significance, and that was only significant for episodic memory, but we'll ignore that for now. Our problem was we wanted to compare what these effects looked like across the different variables. So, but the contact, support, and strain were collected in totally different ways. So social contacts was the sum of the number of contacts they were engaged with. Social support was how frequently they contacted their friends and family. And social strain was how often their friends and family created strain on their relationships. Those are different measures. Those are different units. We couldn't just compare them. So one thing we did here was we used these standardized coefficients, which means you essentially multiply the coefficient by the standard deviation. That gives you a little more standards by which to compare, but it is not completely, does not completely take care of the problem. You have to be aware that you can't just take the magnitude of one association and compare it in terms of a number with another association. You could say I found a statistically significant association, and I also found a statistically significant association with support, but you can't directly compare the numbers. Like for support, it's so much higher than for contacts, 3.4 versus 2.8. That's what I would not do here, because it's not so meaningful.
Sorry, you kind of did say all of this, but
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I caught it all. You said the standardized coefficient is the standard deviation times the magnitude?
No, it's essentially, so I think the way it was done here, and this is the way some people do it, I think for this one, it's the regression coefficient multiplied by the standard deviation.
Okay.
Okay, and that's the way of saying, okay, for the standard deviation of this particular variable, and that allows you to standardize across variables.
And then it does make them slightly more comparable.
So it makes it more comparable. Like in this paper, we did that in order to make it more comparable for the viewer, right? But I still wouldn't directly compare them.
Okay.
Because standard deviations depend on populations for that particular measurement. So they're still not perfectly comparable.
So it's a way of like getting you a little bit closer.
Right.
However, you still should
never directly compare.
You should still never do it. It just slightly calibrates it better.
Exactly. It calibrates it, but it's not really meaningful to directly compare them.
Okay. So then what is the purpose
of the standardized coefficient?
Yeah. To like,
honestly, I'm not a big supporter. I'm not a big supporter of this. Yes, because regardless of whether you're directly saying this was 7 points greater than contacts, you are comparing them in the sense that you're looking at it in the table and you're saying, you know what I mean? It's some sort of comparison that when it's in the table together, it's a little more palatable to make it standardized.
Okay.
It's not always utilized, and it really depends on the situation. Yeah, totally, it made sense for us here, but I wouldn't treat it as a cure-all, which I think some people run to for this. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And, sometimes, like, for example, you'll see, let's say you'll use an odds ratio for age, and the odds ratio will be tiny, 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 because there aren't really big effects for every year in age. I mean, you kind of don't want to show this fraction number, so you just do for every 10-year age. Just because you want to see a bigger number, it just makes it more palatable to read on the table.
Is it kind of fair to say that, like, a lot of this might be done in a sense because you know how people are going to interpret it
Yeah,
in a lot of ways, and so it's
Mhm.
like
Yeah.
you're making that misinterpretation slightly better, but it's not that it like fixes the problem, but it a little bit is like tempering the problem for the readers that you know essentially know are gonna.
Right, and some of it
Okay.
is a number aesthetic, yeah.
Okay.
And so magnitudes are numbers that your brain doesn't want to see like a tiny teeny number and then a really big number and then you're like, what's happening? You know, or I'll give you another example when we have, I'm trying to think of an example where we recently did this, where we just didn't want to, like let's say directions of where your reference is, right? So when we look at, you can either show the results as low income versus the highest income or highest income versus the lowest income. So I tend to like directions to be more or less the same in a table, but it's not incorrect to show the opposite direction.
Okay.
Right? It's just the flip of the coefficient. So
Right.
sometimes you'll do that for aesthetics, and it'll be up to your own aesthetics. Yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, you only do that, I mean, you know, some regression models, you have also different like age and sex and so on. They are also different.
Yes, for sure. And you're not going to be able to change that.
No
Yeah.
one corrects that.
No, so if you have sex and age, I mean, no one's going to be
Whatever.
comparing those, right? But these are all my predictors, and they're all measures of social engagement. So you have a little bit more of a compulsion to maybe compare them, right? How does context different from support, different from strain? I don't think I would be compelled to compare age and sex because I know them to be so different, right? But yes,
something
yeah,
very
so
close.
right, so it's something that's close or something that obvious, something that you want to point out. Your different measures for predictors, right? So here I have 3 different measurements for my same. You know, I was looking at social engagement, but I looked at it 3 different ways. So I have to handle that in a different way. Yeah. But it is important. It's important for your own information. So I think it's a good reminder that you just can't look at. You know, I'll catch myself looking at a table saying, why is the relationship with gender so much higher than age, and age it's per year and gender it's 2 groups. So, you know, you just have to remind yourself of stuff like that all the time. Yeah. So bias we're not going to talk about too much because we've talked about it before, but where does bias discussion come in again at this stage in the study? And again, when you think about it when you're doing your data inference and you think about it when you're writing up your limitations, you want to go back and compare your included and your excluded samples because selection bias is always going to be a potential bias out there. Even if you're at the very end of your study, you may have thought to yourself, wait a second, maybe they're different with regard to, another factor I hadn't thought of. That's always something you can look at. That's always something you can add in your discussion. And then think about possible bias during the course of the study, course of the analysis, course of the data collection. And then finally, the information bias. So information bias could relate to the recall of your participants, and it could be how you classified your participants, right? So all those things come into play, and I would revisit them even at the end as you write it up.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I was just going to say, part of what you're talking about, right? Going and pulling your records. If you're pulling records from different institutions, there is potentially a bias for how things are getting reported.
Yeah.
And so you may not know, and you may have to revisit that again when you get to your analysis.
Because I'm probably going to be physically pulling paper charts and/or in some clinics, and if that's the case, I'm trying to hypothesize how to sort of be random because this chart's thin. Maybe I like that because they seem to be easy to pull data out of, or that one's thick and they are,
Right.
Right. But it, I mean, particularly if you get to places that have a few staff, they may be there. Someone's systematically coding something one way, right? Versus
So there are ways. So I can't tell you how many brownie points you get by just mentioning this in your limitations. The more open and honest you are, the more the reviewer, the reader will know. Okay, they are aware of their limitations, and you're making the reviewer and the reader know that, oh, good point, let's keep that in mind. It doesn't invalidate your study. It only makes it stronger to be aware up front of your limitations. And it gives you an idea on what to do when you do get more information to address this bias, what to do for the next study, right? Okay, so let's shift over to causal inference. So as I mentioned, when we talk about is an association real, our next step is, okay, it's real. I've minimized bias as much as I can. I've tested for statistical significance. I'm not, I'm taking everything into account. But is this association causal? And what evidence do I need to determine causality? So this has been of great concern to public health researchers across the ages. And the discussion of judging causal relationships, it has come up many times. So I'm going to go through the history a bit because I think it's really insightful. So the first set of Henle and Koch's postulates were established in 1840 and then later reestablished in the 1880s, kind of edited and revised. These were centered around infectious diseases, and you could see by what they're saying, right? So here are the three main postulates. The organism is always found with a disease. The organism is not found with any other disease, okay? So you're thinking smallpox, you're thinking cholera, you're thinking, right? So it doesn't work in many other diseases that we could think about. When isolated, this organism can produce disease in animals, right? So all these three, according to Henle and Koch, had to be valid in order for it to be determined causal. This causes this, right? These guidelines did not work for chronic diseases, did not work for heart disease, did not work for cancer. So a whole set of guidelines were modified for non-infectious diseases in the 60s in the US, and then modified again by the US Public Health Service in the 1990s. And these are what they look like. These are the 9 kind of main points of evidence for causal relationships, but as you will see, they're not in a it's supposed to be somewhat in order. They're not really a strong order. Some of these are weaker than others. Some of these are necessary, and some of these are really not necessary. So just to go through them briefly, a temporal relationship, as Danielle mentioned, is basically necessary to determine causality. The strength of the association, the stronger the association, the more support for causality, but it is not entirely necessary for causality, okay? And it's somewhat subjective strength. It's not a cut point, right? Dose-response relationship. This is also an iffy thing. So we'll see an example. Dose-response meaning the more dose you get of predictor, the higher the risk of the outcome, as opposed to a threshold where you get up to one level and then you have like an even risk, okay? Dose response would support causality because the more you get of something, the more you get the disease, would kind of support the idea that one causes the other, but it is not necessary, okay? Replication of findings is pretty much a necessity for any scientific study. Biologic plausibility, considering alternate explanations. So these are guidelines that you go through. Have I thought of everything else this could possibly be, meaning all confounders? The cessation of exposure is interesting. So it means if you stop the exposure, does the disease go away? If you stop someone from smoking, will they not get lung cancer? We cannot say that, right? But it doesn't mean smoking doesn't cause lung cancer. But seeing that the disease goes away with the cessation of exposure may provide more evidence, right? So this is an accumulation of evidence. Yeah, go ahead.
Could cessation of exposure in that particular example almost be like a dose response, right? Like if you think about the former smoker on that slide, I could see how you could.
But I wouldn't treat a former smoker as let's say pack years of cigarettes.
So I guess the pack years would end up being the dose response,
right?
And then the cessation of exposure could potentially
be the
argument that like former smokers, if you're controlling for pack years,
right? So it's kind of two different. One is saying that the more cigarettes you smoke, the higher your risk. Okay. The other is saying that asserting that there's some sort of irreversible irreversible process that took place, or reversible process took place, which is should not be necessary for causation. I'm not quite sure how it got into here, but
Got it.
if you do reverse it, it seems like it provides evidence for causality. It doesn't mean that not reversing it makes it not causal.
Got it.
That's the point.
Right. And maybe this is off a little bit, but when I think of cessation of exposure in that sense, it's not the current exposure, right? So you had the past exposure, but you stopped your exposure to the current smoke. So you're not smoking.
But that should reduce. See, I think they're still thinking of infectious diseases here.
Yeah, well,
I think the thought here was a virus or a bacteria, right? So I think this is still residual from the infectious. Yeah.
So if you're giving, for example, immunotherapy and the patient gets a pneumonitis or something, and you stop it, and then it's going.
And they
away.
stop and they get better.
Yeah, then
Right.
it's causality.
Right. It's right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you see cessation of exposure,
It could provide evidence for causality.
yeah, but it won't necessarily, if you don't see it, it doesn't detract necessarily in certain context.
Because there's some irreversible processes in these, in especially chronic diseases. So, and smoking is a great example, right? Consistency with other knowledge. This is an interesting criteria that I think that those who wrote the guidelines were referring to. For example, if I say that smoking causes lung cancer and then secondary smoke also causes lung cancer, that's being consistent, right? That's saying these two things are so connected, and now I see them also relate, right? It's consistency with other things. This is a relatively weak guideline. You will only find it with certain conditions. And this was very much, I think, with the smoking involved, because this came at a time where, and I think it was Dahl and Hill's guidelines were also created post the smoking lung cancer. So I think smoking lung cancer played a big role in these guidelines formulation. And then the last thing is a specificity of this association, meaning smoking will only cause lung cancer and nothing else, which we know not to be true. So that's the weakest of all of them, right? Nothing else will cause lung cancer but smoking. Okay, if you find that kind of association, again, think, infectious diseases, then of course that's a very strong association. It's just not going to work in most conditions.
So the guidelines might actually more properly be highly varied based on what we're actually looking at.
Exactly. So there has been, and I'll show you revised guidelines even further that took apart some of these, reordered them, essentially I think dropped out 9, or reordered them in order of priority.
Yeah. Because chronic disease would be different than infectious disease.
Right.
Would be different than
so essentially there are different guidelines. And the point is, there isn't one rubric. It's just that the test for causality has to be rigorous. We can't willy-nilly assign causality, and that's why epidemiologists don't use that word. You will not see, because to say something is causal, you would have to run many longitudinal studies. You would have to run randomized control trials. You have to really put this to the test in many different ways, replicate your findings in many different ways, and then finally say it's causal. And even then, there's a lot of hesitance to say that, right? Infectious diseases are obviously more prone to that. Okay, so this is a graph I always like to show, and this, you'll tell me which of these criteria this kind of provides evidence for. This is, the blue line is the per capita cigarette consumption in the United States for those ages 18 and older, and the red and green, red is male and green is female, are lung cancer death rates. So here you see the lung cancer age-adjusted death rates. Here you see the per capita cigarette consumption, okay, the blue. And here are the years, all right? Now, blue should have been for male and female too, but it's not. So this is the overall. So the per capita cigarette consumption peaked in 1955 or so. It's a little incorrect because for males it peaked in World War II, and for females it peaked about 20 to 30 years later. So for females it peaked actually in the 1970s, not in so like the average of the two is 1955, but that's not really accurate. All right, what does it, now we see the peak of lung cancer deaths around 30 years after the peak of cigarette consumption for males. And we see the peak a little bit later for females. What does this point evidence to in our list of causality criteria? Temporal, for sure, right? We see one peak before the other.
Yeah, though you kind of just hinted towards it. It's an average.
It's an average, but either peak happened before the peaks of lung cancer, right? So even the male and female peak. So actually you see it much more clearly when you see the male and female one.
Yeah.
It'll be like 30-year gaps, very neatly stacked,
Okay.
right? And this is something, lung cancer was really rare in the early 1900s, and it just blossomed with cigarette smoking. So this is one of these very clear examples of this is an ecologic study. This is not an individual-based study. These are not individual cigarette smoking rates and those individuals' death rate, lung cancer risk, right? So this is an ecologic study, and still we're finding a relationship that we know to be true, so that helps. But the temporal part of it is what's interesting here, okay? Not all relationships show this kind of nicely situated pattern. Here we see one other kind of guideline evidence in terms of here's ischemic heart disease is the outcome. Diastolic blood pressure is on the left, and fruit and vegetable intake is on the right. And we see relative risk increasing with increasing diastolic blood pressure and decreasing with decreasing fruit and vegetable intake. So this points to the dose response, right? Again, this it provides more evidence because it says, okay, the more you do one, the more you get the other, right? But again, it could be that there's just a certain amount of, you get to a certain diastolic blood pressure and you've hit your risk of heart disease. Or it could be that you just don't eat a certain amount of fruits and vegetables, and at that point you're at risk of heart disease. So a threshold effect is possible.
It could be also that they eat more other junk foods.
Right.
That's why
In return, yeah,
probably
exactly.
That's more
They eat more right. And the threshold, you're saying, and you hit a threshold, right? So a threshold effect does not negate the causality.
You're saying that it might be
the junk food which
the
causes
junk food that is the association,
And
it's
not the
just,
fruits
not
and
the
vegetables.
fruits. I don't know.
Not the decrease in fruits and vegetables. Yeah,
The
that.
increase in junk
But
food.
that could be, so in this case, that could be a proxy, right? So it could be that you're eating something.
Mhm.
So if you're eating less vegetables, you're eating more snacks, right?
Mm-hmm.
That could be a proxy situation, but it doesn't mean that the fruits and vegetables are not related. The intake isn't necessarily related. You'd still see a dose response there, right? But a threshold effect would mean that think about junk food too, right? So you eat a certain amount of junk food, and after that, you're at this high risk of heart disease. More junk food is not going to make it worse. Now, we know that not to be the case, but that's what a threshold effect would be. Or you smoke a certain amount of cigarettes, and after that, you're doomed, right? Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean there was not causality, but a dose response gives a little more evidence of causality.
Wouldn't you still argue that even if there's a threshold outside of this, nice dose response, you could still say that it's
causal? Yeah, I think the dose response guideline is not a very strong one, in my opinion. Meaning, I don't think it's a make it or break it one. It's not a deal breaker, but it does indicate that that the predictor is a strong player, because you'd have to explain why it stopped affecting your outcome after a certain point. And so it depends on the mechanism, right? So a lot of this depends on the mechanism.
right.
Here, there was, this was a very famous finding. So the initial interest in socioeconomic status and disease kind of peaked in the 70s and 80s. And it was just used as a control variable. There was no interest in and of itself. And when studies started doing this in the late 80s and early 90s, they realized that they saw this gradient. And this gradient, so here you see a number of different diseases on the left: osteoarthritis, chronic disease, hypertension, cervical cancer, and the socioeconomic status measures all sorts of different measures of socioeconomic status. And no matter what the outcome, there was this gradient, which was very surprising because a threshold effect was expected for socioeconomic status, meaning you're very poor, you have low income, up to a certain level where you can afford basic needs, and then you shouldn't have any difference in your risk, right? So it should be a threshold effect. What we find with socioeconomic status is a very consistent gradient effect, so that people, even a dot, above the lowest level, or a dot below the highest level, are at a different risk. This was very surprising finding and led to researchers rethinking what socioeconomic status was doing, that it was more of a causal player in disease and not just a sideline sort of phenomenon. And part of what led to that was this guideline of dose response. So that's an example of how dose response can give you a little more evidence and pause to think like, okay, it's doing more than I initially thought. Okay, I'm going to skip this one. This is an example of a meta-analysis, right? And this is the guideline of replicating your findings, right? So why do we replicate our findings? Because one study is not enough to determine causality. Even if I have this beautiful longitudinal study and I've determined temporal relationship and everything looks great, one study will never get me to say, or the scientific world to say, this must cause X, right? So we need to replicate our findings in this example of a meta-analysis. And in this meta-analysis, we see odds ratios from all those studies look like there's some risk associated. Okay, so we went through some of the guidelines. Guideline number 5 or 6 is alternate explanations, which is really another way to say confounding. And this is a diagram that we saw before when we talked about confounding. So take our example of an observed association between increased coffee drinking, increased pancreatic cancer, again, in a non-biased way, right? So let's say we really find this, but then we consider smoking and we realize all our association went through that pathway. Okay, that's a pure confounder. So if it was causal, we would not see all the association flow through the smoking. We would see it still remain.
Interesting though, interesting to me. If the right is true, but the left is what we know from all the preponderance of data.
Yeah.
Which do any of the 9 or whatever guidelines we use? I'm having trouble thinking of any of those criteria for causality actually being able to pick up unknown confounders.
No, that's why that's why consideration of alternate explanations is.
So for example, for decades we could be believing the left.
Yeah.
And then at some point discover.
Yeah.
Totally.
I mean, I guess you can't know what you can't know.
You can't know it, right. But yeah, I mean, if we, let's say what was once true, which is not as true anymore, but that all heavy coffee drinkers were heavy smokers. And we consistently saw.
It's not true anymore.
It's not true anymore.
Yeah.
But I mean, that was a really strong association. And so you saw these people who drink a lot of coffee getting sick, then why wouldn't you say coffee causes, right? So that's where the biologic plausibility needs to come in. That's where a lot of studies would eventually, that's why you need the replication of findings. You need and if you have that rigor, you'd hopefully tease this out, right? You'd hopefully eventually tease this out. It wouldn't hold water in some cases, that relationship that's really a completely unconnected relationship wouldn't, hold in all those. The problem is that life doesn't work like that. There's almost nothing that's totally unconnected, right? So, yeah, that's our risk in studies where we might be finding things that are not True. We'll discover that. You know, you watch what was that show called The Midwife, and you see these doctors smoking while they're like performing C-sections. You gotta wonder what was going on. So, and the other part is that when you do measure confounding, you don't always measure it cleanly. Its measurements are just not perfect. So you may find, and that we'll get to that, residual confounding, and that could also lead to problems, right? So even when we adjust for something, we're not fully often adjusting for it. But the one thing I'm glad you mentioned that, because you can still utilize that information. That's what we talked about before. It depends what your intervention is. If you have an etiologic intervention and you want to get rid of all pancreatic cancer by making everyone stop drinking, that's not going to work, right? Drinking coffee. But if you are going to increase awareness by passing out pamphlets for early screening, and you've given it to the heavy coffee drinkers who are also heavy smokers, that's going to work. So confounders can be utilized when utilized properly. If they're really highly associated with something, they might work, which again should not be proof of an association. It just might work from a public health program perspective, right? Sometimes we can affect change without getting the mechanism right. And that's actually with John Snow and cholera. He had them turn off the pump in Broad Street in England without having the germ theory, without really understanding the bacteria, but enough to stop the epidemic. And sometimes that's what we need, right? Okay, so you can read this later, but these are the revised guidelines adapted from Gordis. And so this is in Leon Gordis's book. He's an epidemiologist who passed away fairly recently, another teacher of mine. And he and others put together, so it's this slide and this slide, where they took those criteria, reordered them in level of importance. So now you see temporal relationship, biological plausibility, consistency, alternate explanations. Those are the major criteria. The minor criteria, which we're going to care less about, is the dose response, the strength of an association, the cessation of effects, right? So they included those, but gave them less power. Okay, so confounding, we talked about a little bit, right, just now. One issue I wanted to bring up was this issue of residual confounding. We find this a lot, and I just want to show you an example in this study. So I think we talked through this example. This is a study I did on socioeconomic status and progressive chronic kidney disease in an older population. So the top is the measures of low to high neighborhood socioeconomic status, and this is low to high individual socioeconomic status. So we could just look at the neighborhood for a second. We did levels of stepwise models. The basic model adjusted for, I think it was age, I'll tell you exactly. The basic model adjusted for age, race, serum creatinine at baseline, the study site, and gender. Okay, so here are like our basic confounders. And we found, let's just look at the lowest level, 60% higher risk that was statistically significant for those living in the poorest neighborhoods. Okay? Then we added income and education. Now, the reason we added this in a second step, and we talked about this before in one of our other classes, was that this was part of our pathway of how we thought neighborhoods affected health. And part of the pathway was through individual level factors. So this was a separate step, even though these were also confounders. Okay? These were all our confounders of interest. At this point, this was our main result. Okay? Now, we additionally added lifestyle factors and diabetes and hypertension, but those were our pathways. That's how we thought, or we think, that neighborhood poverty eventually affects kidney disease. It has to affect it somehow. So we posit that through lifestyle factors, and this was smoking, physical activity, what else did I put in there? Number of blocks that they walked, obesity, all those factors, and through the prevalence of diabetes and hypertension, eventually you can affect kidney disease, right? Impact your kidney disease risk. Now, I put in all the things I thought may be on the pathway, and what happens at the end? My risk goes down to 1.4, but it's still statistically significant. So now what's my takeaway?
There's something that's not accounted for.
Right, so I would describe this as residual confounding because I haven't measured all the lifestyle factors I could think of, and I haven't measured them perfectly, right? I only have what I have. So I had a certain measure of physical activity. It wasn't a perfect measure of physical activity. It was self-reported. I had smoking. I had the number of blocks that they walked in the past week, but maybe I should have assessed, another measure of walking, whatever it was. These are not perfectly measured.
If your model was perfect and your measurements were perfect, what you would want to ultimately see is that your basic hazard ratio is 1.6, and then after you account for everything that you sort of hypothesize, it'd be 1.
Yes.
Is that correct? That
Yes.
In an
ideal world, if I put in all the measures I think should be on the pathway,
they should soak
should
up
be
all
1.
the...
Right. And it
Wait,
almost
it should
never
be
happens.
1. Oh, I see.
Right?
Mhm.
So in fact, and I don't believe that none of the lifestyle factors did nothing. I don't believe that. It's most likely the case that they're not measured properly. Right? Same with diabetes and hypertension. There's nothing else I could think of that would affect kidney disease, right? And obviously there could be other things that I'm not thinking of, or there could be other differences between the people that I'm not measuring. There could be a lot
Or
of other
you're
things.
not measuring it at the right time.
Or not the right time, whatever it could be. But just to remind you that these models are statistical models. They don't work perfectly. Our measurements are not perfect, and so because we don't find the results we find, it doesn't mean that our results are not, true. That's why we use language of suggestion, and there is evidence to show X, but we didn't. We're presenting. We're at the stage where we're taking the takeaway, but we want to understand why we haven't found what we expected to find. So the last thing to comment on before we'll talk a few minutes about wording is the interaction. Okay, so is this association that I found similar in different subgroups? Now, this isn't always a question to ask. You may not have an interaction question in your study objective. But if you do, these are two kinds of interaction that you think of. Okay, so there's quantitative interaction, meaning that the effects are in the same direction, depending on that third factor, or qualitative interaction that, in fact, the effects are in the opposite direction, depending on that third factor. So let's see an example of quantitative interaction. This isn't so clear, but this is an interaction between exposure to asbestos and smoking with a relative risk on lung cancer. Okay, so my outcome is lung cancer here. So my reference is those who are not smokers and no asbestos risk. Okay, so no asbestos exposure. So that's the one. Okay, smoking with no asbestos is a 21.7 relative risk, and then asbestos with no smoking is 10.2, and then the two of them together is 43.1.
Can you compare? You can compare.
Yes. So that's a good question. So what you're saying is being a smoker compared to not being a smoker is associated with a 21-fold risk, right? You're right that exposure to asbestos, it's a binary measure. So you can compare it magnitude in the sense of
like the 21 to the 10.
Yes, because we're not talking about the units here. It's a good question because you still have to compare.
Yeah.
There's still different measures, but this is a yes or no.
Defined?
Right.
Okay.
Right. So what sort of so this is quantitative. Why?
it increases the, those concerns.
They're both going up, right? It's just that it seems like adding the smoking makes it a lot worse. Okay, so there's multiplicative or additive interaction. There's interaction where you take one, you basically add the other, and it together gives you the same risk. This actually seems like higher than additive, but it's not multiplicative. You're not multiplying 21 times 10. But it's a little more than adding them. It's basically adding them plus 10, right? So it's not that, okay, obviously if you're exposed to asbestos and it's a high risk, and you're a smoker and it's high risk, together it's going to be even more of a high risk. That's not always true, okay? So in this case, it is true. But the risk is more than just each of those separate, right? Or each of those added. It's actually higher. What about qualitative? So this is, which is interesting. I'm not sure why this is true, but this was so having used hormone replacement therapy, depending on your body mass index, depending on your BMI level, is associated with different relative risk of endometrial cancer. So in this analysis, low BMI, so assuming, let's say that's normal weight, I don't know, they don't have underweight category here, so assuming normal weight and use of HRT has a 1.5 relative risk. Overweight and use of HRT has basically no relative risk. And then obese and use of HRT is protective of endometrial cancer in this analysis. So I don't know the biology of it. We won't go into it. But basically, if you see this is a qualitative interaction. These are going in opposite directions. This is an interaction you have to worry about, because if you ignored this interaction, you would get misleading findings, right? Because you'd get kind of an average of the two if you didn't take into account BMI.
You'd probably find nothing.
Right.
If you didn't take it into account.
Right. And you'd find, right, and even if you did and you controlled for BMI, that's the important thing. You wouldn't, because they're in opposite directions, controlling would not help you get to the bottom of the differences,
So you have to add an interaction.
So the way you test the interaction, so again, like there could be right, you want an a priori reason for assessing interaction, but to test that, I like stratifying, right? So because when I stratify, I know what's happening. To test it statistically, you'd put in an interaction term.
Okay.
But I don't think that's the best way to look at what's happening. Okay, so unexpected results, non-significant results, you report them all, right? Especially if you're in your main objective, you have to report them. Let's talk about wording for a second. So for a few minutes, guess the time we have. Wordsmithing is important. It's important because our inference from our studies is everything we have, right? That's how we are translating to the scientific public, to the lay public, what our findings are. And so the way we word things is crucial. We are interpreting our measures of risk. We are determining our conclusive evidence. We have to talk about association versus causation, right? We don't use the word causation usually. And in general, we should word with caution. Okay, so let me show you some examples of this. So this is that study that I showed you, okay, where we ended up with results that didn't kind of explain away everything. So the way these were worded, Cox proportional hazard models showed that living in the lowest SES quartile as opposed to the highest was associated with a 50% greater risk, because the second model was my main model, after adjusting for blah, 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 blah. I didn't just say, being in a poor area causes kidney disease. I had to wordsmith it through, because that's how we explain our findings. I was interviewed by a reporter, actually, I think on this study, and they you cannot give like a 5-second soundbite when you're trying, and that's one of the problems in translating science to the public. It's just wordy, it's verbose, it's heavy, it just can't, but I don't think it can be done in another way. So I think one of our challenges as scientists and clinicians and translating to the public is that we have to explain complicated things in a measured, cautious way and make an impact, right? That's our challenge. I just want to show you an example of something that upset me. I gave this example to my undergraduate epi class. And so breastfeeding and obesity, a cross-sectional study. Look at the objective. To assess the impact of breastfeeding on the risk of obesity. When I see the word impact, I see longitudinal. That just could be my aesthetics, right? But my, semantic things. But look, read their conclusions. In industrialized countries, promoting prolonged breastfeeding may help decrease the prevalence of obesity. We know that to be true. We have a lot of evidence to be true, but they were utilizing this study and interpreting it as a longitudinal study. It's a purely cross-sectional study. That you cannot use that kind of language, that one will decrease the other, because that implies causation. I would have critiqued this as a reviewer. Not that they're not correct in the general scientific sense, but that was not the finding from this particular study. It's too powerful a set of words. It's not what they found. They found an association. Yeah.
They would maybe be able to say something like the industrialized countries have a decreased prevalence, but they're implying
there's like
the part where it says may help decrease.
Right, so they said this evidence may suggest, right, that industrialized countries can decrease the prevalence of obesity with prolonged, meaning it shouldn't be the conclusion of my study. It should be that my study has added to the evidence that would suggest or inform the promotion of breastfeeding. It's a very semantic thing, but it's one that I think we need to keep in mind when we interpret our own studies. Okay, 2 words about before we're going to get a knock on the door. Just a couple words, and we have another class after this. You'll see, he gets very anxious. Okay, so discussions and conclusions. This is we've talked a lot about this, but I kind of just have a few slides on this section of our papers. What do I include in my discussion section? So you want to summarize your findings. You're not rewording everything in the results. You're summarizing them in a takeaway way, right? I think of when you want to explain it to a non-scientist, this is a great practice to do, is try to think of explaining it to, your brother, your cousin, your whatever, your grandparent, your parent. That is the kind of way you want to explain the discussion section. Don't put in numbers, okay? Maybe put 50% or something. Don't put in your actual point estimates in the discussion section. How does this contribute to the previous literature? You've said a little bit of this maybe in the introduction. Sometimes it's nice to add more about this in the discussion section. The possible pathways are usually discussed in the discussion section, and the strengths, limitations, conclusion. So the findings, I talked about this before, you want to address the main objectives in your findings, right? Your findings, you may have unexpected findings that you want to put in the discussion section, but you always start with your findings with regard to your main objective. And again, you want to distinguish between your confounders, your mediators, your causal pathway. So what's different about the conclusion, and sometimes you don't put in a conclusion, but when papers have a conclusion, how is that different from the discussion? So the conclusion is often, what are my next steps? How does this inform future research? In that breast cancer study, in that breastfeeding study, I would say that would be my conclusion. It seems like promoting breastfeeding would decrease prevalence of obesity, something like that. But that would be it seems from this that future research should look at that, or policy should consider that. And that's often the additive part of conclusions. And that's it. Yeah.
Yep.
So feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions about, I know we need to get back to the 2 of you about comments, or no? We don't have We got back with comments. We just have to get back to you with comments. In terms of due date for the final project, we can set it to, what did we say, June 6th, 7th, or even?
Yeah, even,
I thought you had said
After that weekend.
presentation on the 5th.
Yes,
we did.
so
And then the paper due the week after.
yes,
Right.
the weekend, right
Which I
after the weekend.
interpreted to be
yes.
That's the
June
10th.
12th.
Yeah.
Oh, or 10th or whatever. but
I
just-
think grades are due so that's fine with me.
Yeah.
We could
Yeah.
do the 10th. Let's maybe say the Monday. So
Monday the 10th.
Monday the
Great.
10th. Okay, so the final project we'll do Monday the 10th. In terms of presentations,
The paper is due the 10th, the presentation.
the presentation
Yeah.
is on the 5th.
Right.
Our expectations are presentations from the two of you, but if you guys want to present something or just talk us through, so you get the group's feedback, if you feel comfortable or want to, then feel free to.
But
Yeah.
not
It's
required.
not required
Not
because
required at
of,
all.
right.
Are there guidelines posted for the presentation, or are we just essentially presenting like
Do
an
we put it up?
abstract?
I don't think we probably did put anything up. I would say that I think what you should do is plan to spend 10 to 15 minutes. So
Okay.
describing
Yeah.
your project, so a little bit of background, take it through the methods and your proposed analyses, and then we'll open it up. And what we're hoping is that your classmates may have some thoughts too. So
Yeah, it's just an
But again,
opportunity to
yes.
hash it out with us.
Exactly. So if there are things that you're still trying to decide, sort of include that here and
Yeah.
say, I'm thinking that I could get these, but these kinds of measures are going to be hard, and these are some possible alternative explanations that I'm trying to think about getting data for. So
Right. Yeah, and I would think of it in the sections that we had you write it in, right? So
Yes.
the objective, like a little intro, objectives, methods.
Sorry, there was something due today.
yeah, but we messed that up.
But
We
it
said-
just was the paper.
Yeah, it was a
Okay.
paper.
Okay, great,
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
That's
Normally
what I
we
thought.
have
So
it
we
do
got
it.
your draft. Yeah, no, got your draft.
Normally
Yeah,
we have it
crazy
do on the last
rambling
day, but it's
email.
fine. Yeah.
And
Okay.
so we'll get back to you. So all we'll want from you is just one final pulling together
Of
of
everything.
everything
Yeah.
into a single document. And same thing for you, Erin, just one thing pulling together.
Okay.
Great,
Thank you.
you bet.